Welcome everyone. I am thrilled to join you today for our third event of the Emerging Tech Economic Research Network, also known as EARN. I am Louise Willard, and I serve as Executive Vice President and Chief Information Officer here at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. I also serve on the Executive Leadership Advisory Group for EARN. EARN seminars are opportunities for academics, researchers, and technologists who are studying the economic impacts of emerging technologies to exchange ideas, learn about research from different sectors, and share insights more broadly known with those who are interested in these topics. We've had such a great response to our first two events, where we've heard from noted economists on how generative artificial intelligence, or Gen AI, is shaping the future economy. Today's third installment of our series will take the long view on how Gen AI developments help boost wages and standard of living. However, there's also a danger that Gen AI will primarily drive automation and further widen the income inequality. To help us explore these possible futures, we'll hear from Simon Johnson, Professor of Entrepreneurship at MIT Sloan School of Management and head of the Global Economics and Management Group. Professor Johnson will present his recent research on technology and inequality. Following his presentation, Professor Johnson will discuss the research with our host moderator, Wei-Yu Lee, co-head of EARN and research advisor at the SF Fed. I cannot wait to hear this discussion. It should be both thought-provoking and timely. Over to you, Wei-Yu.
Thank you, Louise. I'm very excited about this seminar. I remember being a graduate student reading Professor Johnson's work with Daron Acemoglu. I really appreciate that their work bring in historical evidence to answer the very key questions that we have today. So I'm very excited to learn about his current research with all of you. Simon, over to you.
Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak today and for the kind words of introduction. As it's the San Francisco Fed and as you're all very concerned with the sort of the impact and implications for policy, let me start with our bottom line from at least where how we currently assess the technology, and then I'll explain how we get to this position in a little bit more detail. So the question that we're attempting to address is in both a recent book, which I'll talk about, and also in our research center at MIT, is what impact should we expect from the latest wave of artificial intelligence developments, let's call those generative AI as a shortcut. What impact do we think that will have on jobs and on incomes, for example, over the next 20 years? Now, that's a stretch to look out that far, of course, but it's not unreasonable, and I think that's as economists, we should push ourselves to see if there's something we can say that's sensible about that kind of time horizon. Now, I don't know about you, but when I talk to people around the US in particular, I encounter two views typically. One is a pretty extreme form of techno-optimism. So the techno-optimism goes, AI is going to increase productivity. Those productivity increases will be large, maybe very large, and perhaps no one else will need to work again. So then the question we should be dealing with is how do we share those productivity gains through whatever mechanism you prefer, like universal basic income, for example. On the other hand, there's also some pretty extreme forms of techno-pessimism that I hear, which suggest that rapid automation brought to us or accelerated further by AI could create mass unemployment. So almost no one gets a job. Wealth and income becomes massively more concentrated, and it could be that marginal productivity doesn't go up by much. So you may not get paid much if you're not one of the lucky ones who actually owns the technology that turns out to run the world. Now, our view, and what I'm calling our baseline scenario out 10 to 20 years, is somewhat less dramatic. We think the US productivity growth will remain roughly on its current trend. AI will be part of that mix, but it's not going to give you an acceleration. We do expect on our current trajectory that job market polarization will widen further, and that means bigger income gaps, more inequality. We'll talk about that. We also think, though there's much less evidence on this, so this is more speculative, there's a high likelihood that global inequality will increase both within countries and across countries, and I'll come to that towards the end of my talk. The key point of our research and the work we do in the policy space is that it doesn't have to be this way. There's nothing baked in the technology cake that says it's got to be very unequalizing or something else. That's the result of choices that we will make, that we are making, well, that somebody's making, so we need to think about who's making those choices. And one reason we wrote our book, Power and Progress, is to go through the history of who made such choices in the past, because in the past, it's played out quite differently in different situations. And I'll talk about some examples. Now, I did have the opportunity to speak to one of the leading entrepreneurs in this space, and somebody who I think, if I were to tell you his name, which I won't, you would agree is a visionary. And I asked him, what is the likely impact of jobs of AI and the kind of AI that he and others are trying to bring to fruition? And he said, we will all be gods. Meaning that our capabilities, every one of us, will be so enormous and immense that to people of today looking forward, if we could see what happens 20, 50, I don't know, 100 years in the future, it would just be an amazing, fantastic shared future. I think that could happen. It's pretty remote probability, and we can talk about why. Much more likely to be the key question, well, I think it is the key question of today, but also the foreseeable future, is who exactly gets good jobs from this technology, and what happens to the good jobs that already exist? To what extent are they disrupted or even eliminated? Now, as I mentioned, Daron Acemoglu and I have a book, a relatively new book on this, Power and Progress, our 1,000-year struggle over technology and prosperity. So yes, we are taking the relatively long view about some of these issues, although I would say I recently attended a very interesting conference in London where there was a lot of discussion about what happened 12,000 years ago. So we do have some views on that. We focus on the relatively more modern period of 1,000 years, for which we think there's a pretty good record of technology developments and economic impact. This work is supported by MIT Shaping the Future of Work initiative, which is co-run by me, Daron, and David Orter. And we thank the Hewlett Foundation also for funding that center. So the problem, as we see it, is that this moment of AI comes to us when the US economy has already become highly polarized compared to the previous version after World War II, for example. And since the 1980s, there's a lot of evidence that suggests companies have been using automation to cut labor costs. And you can see this playing out in job market polarization. These pictures are actually from the work of David Orter, and I think they're quite famous at this point. So you can see that since the early 1960s, the change in real log weekly earnings for men at the top and women at the bottom have diverged based on education. College-age men have done very well. Men who've not gone to college have done really quite poorly, and some of them may not have higher real earnings than they or people like them had 50, 60 years ago. For women, it's a little bit less dramatic, but you can still see a widening of the outcomes there. Now, quite likely, at least as it's currently being developed and deployed, AI will exacerbate this divergence, meaning that people with a lot of education, including most people at the San Francisco Fed, probably most people watching this live stream, will find ways to benefit from this technology and will be compensated for the increased importance or marginal value of their expertise. So one CEO said to me, obviously not going to tell you his name either, that the jobs that will be eliminated are what he called, his term, not mine, the cut and paste jobs. So by this he meant white collar jobs which involve a substantial routine element. They're not entirely routine because otherwise they would have been automated already, but you can think of them as being perhaps between the 20th and 30th decile of the earned income distribution. They are a lot of times starter jobs in offices. They may be jobs that people have for a long time also. Those jobs, I think, are absolutely in the line of fire, and companies are currently figuring out how to use AI to replace some of those positions. This is going to imply a considerable amount of, in the good scenario, where people remain employed and we don't have a lot of unemployment, there'll be a lot of employment transitions. McKinsey did an interesting study on this recently, and they found that the amount of transition needed in the US to keep up with, to provide enough opportunities to keep up with the displacement of workers from AI, they thought that would have to run at about the same rate as we had before COVID. So that's okay, in a sense, we did that before COVID. Europe, the pressure is actually going to be more, according to the McKinsey study. They'll have to step up to closer to what they had during COVID, and that's very hard for them to sustain. So there's already a flag of differential impact between the US and the European Union, for example, or the major European economies on this. There are also additional risks, which we talk about at length in the book. I probably won't spend much time on them, at least in my opening remarks today, along the lines of what AI will do for misinformation, disinformation, social media, digital advertising, because I think that's a very big additional potential game changer. If the technology makes it harder for the democracy to function well, then our usual pressure valves for any kind of social problem, which is that people articulate their concerns through the democratic process, that process may not operate as well, at least in this phase of AI development. Now, I think you know, certainly pretty sure almost all the economists here are fully aware that we have experienced a squeeze in labor share over recent decades. And, you know, if you see this from the perspective of Milton Friedman or other advocates of the predominant model of capitalism that we've had in the US, at least since the 1980s, I think many of them would say this is a feature, not a bug. We shifted the balance of power towards capital, unions became worker, labor share has been squeezed. Labor share in the US remains slightly higher than in some other countries, so perhaps it could go down even further. But the key point is that we've had more than 4 decades of squeezing labor, job market polarization, and probably AI is going to continue us down this path. In addition, so that was about the US. In addition, there's obviously, or there should obviously, hopefully it's obvious to everyone, there are concerns about what happens to global inequality. So we've clearly had the rise of some emerging markets in recent decades. I'll say a little bit more about them and their wages in a few slides. But in many of those countries, they have found a position in the global value chain that's either based on large-scale manufacturing with relatively low labor costs, or in the case of India, large-scale provision of services in and around IT. Well, if AI is adopted in the way that we expect, then there will likely be a big impact in some of those low-end IT jobs. We're already seeing a discussion of the reduction of outsourcing of some of those positions. Perhaps India can shift in some other way, but it remains to be seen. Manufacturing, I would say, is still some ways off from having a big impact from AI, and we can talk about why that is if you're interested. But it is coming. It is absolutely coming, and I have some very smart colleagues, including at MIT, who are working hard on bringing AI onto the shop floor for manufacturing. So what will that do to the opportunities for these emerging markets 5, 10, 15 years down the road? I think that remains a big question. And again, very likely that we'll get more inequality if we stay on our current path. But there is another path, and this is what we explore in the book. The term that we coin and are trying to get people to use and think more about is the productivity bandwagon, which we argue is a pretty standard assumption in economics, and that goes along the lines of new technologies invented, productivity increases, measured somehow, and that's passed through into higher wages. And unfortunately, that's not necessarily the case, and that's not also, or particularly what's happened in the US in many sectors and for many people since the 1980s. But it has happened before, and in fact, the Industrial Revolution, which was a bit bumpy at the beginning with regard to real wages, by the mid-19th century, benefits were starting to pass down to workers in terms of their pay, their living standards, working conditions. And the US is a really fascinating and tremendously important example in this regard, because in the mid-19th century, the US had almost no industry. At the Great Exhibition of London, which was the first of its kind in 1851, the Crystal Palace exhibition, the US showed up. Everyone was invited from around the world to bring their best industrial achievements. The US showed up with some stuffed animals, meaning animals that had been shot and stuffed, and the guns they'd used to shoot them. That was it. By the 1890s, the US was the world's largest manufacturing power. So this was a dramatic transformation. How did the US do this? Well, this is something that's been studied very extensively by economic historians. And the people who've looked into this, the industrial system that developed in the US, called it the American system of manufacturing, meaning specifically using machines to boost the productivity of workers who did not have much formal education. This happened then, and we think this continues to happen now, when those machines replace some manual work for sure, there's an automation element, but they also create a sufficient number of new tasks. And those new tasks require expertise, and you get paid for your expertise in carrying out valuable tasks. All of us get paid for that, I would suggest, unless we are in some other unusual circumstances, but it's expertise that creates value. If you don't have expertise, or your expertise can be replicated entirely by somebody who's hired off the street tomorrow, you're very unlikely to get a premium wage in this or many other economies. So this transformation that happened in the US was dramatic. It was particularly beneficial to less educated workers, and it spread around the world because American technology for sewing machines, for farm equipment, and for automobiles was adopted elsewhere. In addition to the higher marginal productivity, trade unions became important in many economies and were able to solidify those gains. They were able to gain political representation. They were able to put other protections for workers in place. So we have, in a sense, in a very profound and real sense, in Western economies and economies that industrialized early and increasingly around the world, potentially solved the problem of shared prosperity. But before industrialization, there were plenty of instances when technology improved, there was more income available from higher productivity, but all the income went to the rich people, and the rich people used it for their own palaces or the cathedrals that they felt benefited themselves primarily, did not trickle down or pass down in any way to other people. That's not what happened in the 19th century and early 20th century. So if you think about railways, for example, and you think about the transformation of the technology from George Stephenson's engine in the bottom to top of the line, a British engine showing there from the 1880s at the top, this created jobs, including for the chap who's standing on the engine at the top picture. These were highly paid jobs for working class people, ticket takers, engine drivers, firemen. These were good jobs, and this was the beginning of the development of a broader middle class. In addition, of course, the railroads had other big knock-on effects in terms of creating tasks requiring expertise around the country and the world. And the US auto industry is in some ways an even better example, because when Henry Ford came to Detroit at the beginning of the 1900s, there were 10,000 workers making 20,000 cars, roughly speaking, handcrafted. By 1929, there were 400,000 workers in the US auto industry, and GM and Ford combined made 3 million cars. So for Henry Ford, to be clear, and others in that era, brought car assembly onto the moving production line, which was a big form of automation, and brought electricity to the production line. So tasks previously carried out by humans were now done by machines. Let's be very, very clear about that. But at the same time, all of these changes created a large number of other tasks, both upstream for all the components feeding into the assembly line, and downstream in terms of everything that cars needed, everything that cars enabled. That was a very big pro-employment, in our terminology, pro-worker transformation of industry. Now, you can see this in the post-war period, for example. If you look at what happened to US wages, I'm going to show you nominal wages here, and in a couple of slides I'll show you real wages. I think for the first part of my period, the nominal wages tell the story quite well, which is a steady rise. This is also the strong effects of strong unionization in the private sector, and a growth of those wages relative to other benchmark reference countries here, including India. China we have data on later, but you'll see. I think it's reasonable to say it was around the level of India. Japan is interesting, and I'll come back to Japan, because Japan does have some productivity transformations, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, the real wages rise, this is for low-skilled workers, with a little bit of a lag, it has to be said, but by the 1980s, including because of what's happened in terms of exchange rate policy, Japanese wages are at a similar level to American wages for low-skilled workers. So that's an important achievement on the part of Japan. It's an important reference point for what has happened in the United States. And again, that post-war period was a period of rising productivity, strong total factor productivity growth, strong wage growth by historical standards, looking either before or after, including across the income scale, including across the education scale, although low-skilled, low-educated people still need to acquire expertise in order to access a high-paying job. So back to AI. What is AI at its heart? What are we seeing around us? What's being talked about? What are the use cases that are attracting attention? And what do we see the scientists and other technologies working on? Well, clearly it's an automation technology. It's going to displace labor. Average productivity per worker will increase. Sure, that's arithmetically how that happens, but this doesn't necessarily increase wages. Early British Industrial Revolution, as I mentioned before, if you look carefully at what happened to real wages in and around both Lancashire and the textile industry, or even Britain as a whole, from 1780 to, let's say, 1840, there was not much increase in real wages. There were a couple of ups and downs. There were some people who did better, for sure, including the rising middle class. But in terms of most textile workers, for example, there was not a big or sustained or significant increase in the standard of living until at least the 1830s, perhaps well into the 1840s. So that's a 60-year lag after the introduction of what I think has to be seen as really revolutionary spinning technology and weaving technology. And if someone says to you, good news, AI will boost wages in 60 years, I think it's pretty reasonable to say, well, can't we accelerate that process? Because we've had a lot of experience and hopefully we've learned some things about how to translate productivity transformations or technology change into higher standards of living. Now, there will presumably be new tasks created by AI, and this is something that the US economy is good at. David Autor and some co-authors have established that more than 60% of the jobs that we had in 2018 did not exist in 1940. So in a sense, this process is ongoing. We're not asking or needing something to start from scratch. And that new task creation was an important part of sustaining prosperity from, let's say, 1940 to 1980. But at the same time, and the same researchers agree, and the same lines of research and the same data suggest very strongly that since 1980, new tasks have not kept up with the loss of good jobs due to automation. So if you go back to the McKinsey study, which is relatively sanguine, that says, oh, the US will have to create new jobs to replace the lost opportunities at a pace that matches what we were doing before COVID, all right, that's a positive, but that's also a period in which income was diverging and our economy was becoming more polarized, and so was our society. So that's not such great news. Now, the latest research, and I think you've had some of this in your series, and hopefully you'll have a chance to talk to more people as these papers come out. The latest research has some encouragement. It says, or provides some encouragement, if you use AI in some ways, you can provide expert advice, you can distill information, make it accessible to people, you could level workers up, you could help workers with less formal education be more capable in terms of writing, as in writing language, writing code also, and in terms of customer service. The evidence from Eric Brynjolfsson and others is that the customer service reps aided by AI in a particular context are better able to provide satisfying answers to the people who contact them. And not only do the people seeking advice feel good about this. The workers also feel good about this. However, I would also say that some other keen observers of the customer service space are pretty confident that this is only phase one of the AI impact, at least on customer service people who provide initial support before problems get bumped up, perhaps because they're more difficult. That initial, some people call it level one customer service, is likely to be abolished entirely. And the training of the algorithm that is being done by the customer service reps today is likely an important part of developing the capabilities of the software that will replace them tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or within the foreseeable future. So there's a very dynamic situation. Yes, workers can gain, but workers can also be massively replaced, including in jobs that were previously considered to be well paid. In addition to concerns about the sort of overall distributional impact, we should think about skills and think about skill gaps. And again, there's some interesting work here. Everything is very preliminary in this space. So what kind of skills do we need? Who has those skills? What are the barriers to acquiring those skills? Are there ways to accelerate the acquisition of those skills? I think the evidence is still pretty mixed on this, but there are some interesting indications. And the good news is that some very smart people are working super hard to try and identify, pin down those skills and try and persuade people to acquire the skills or provide the skills to their employees if that's what's needed to create more good jobs. If you needed to identify some vulnerable people today, and this is a question we get asked a lot, again, with plenty of caveats that the jury is still out on a lot of this, it does seem that some jobs done by women, some jobs done by younger workers are most at risk. So these are groups that may need to make more of a transition to new opportunities than others. This is work, for example, done by LinkedIn, which, as you know, is part of Microsoft and pretty well informed about AI. Now, there are some very optimistic forecasts about the macroeconomic impact of AI. Some of those forecasts are about the US economy, some of them about the global economy. My colleague Daron Acemoglu has written a paper directly on this. I think our joint view is that the big numbers are somewhat exaggerated. John Williams, the president of the New York Fed, I think had a good statement, which is you should expect the US economy to keep chugging along about 1.5% productivity growth, which is where we've been for a while. AI will be part of how we get to 1.5, but it's not going to give you an acceleration beyond that. So I don't know if you want to call it incremental technology. It's going to be quite profound in some of the impact, but it's going to be part of the normal process of what happens in the US economy and what filters out to the rest of the world, rather than something that completely changes available incomes and how the Fed thinks about economic growth or anything else. Now, there is also, in just a couple more slides, we should turn back to and think a little bit, or at least for a moment, about that global context that I mentioned earlier. Because when I turn that nominal wage chart, that was nominal wages for low-skilled workers, turn that into real wages, you can see the counterpart of the widening inequality picture that I showed at the very beginning, which is real wages rose 1950s through into the 1970s, but have stagnated for low-skilled workers in the US since that time. Now, in the same, if we also make the conversion into real wages, Japan still shows this growth in real wages, growth in wages from the 1970s, and it does move up to be close to the US level. And I would actually say that's a success case. That's what economic development is supposed to deliver: higher productivity, higher wages, converging towards rich income. Rich countries levels. But look at the China line down here. So I think this is I don't know if you want to call it an anomaly. I think China is so big we shouldn't call it anything an anomaly. We should just call it China and note that it's a very big part of the global economy. So productivity has increased a lot in China. Poverty has declined for sure. Some people at the upper end of the income distribution have done very well. But it's quite striking that for the low-skilled workers, there the kind of increase we've seen in Japan, or if I showed you South Korea, it would be even more dramatic. So just remember that we're encountering automation with the US and a few other countries considered to be relatively high wage. So perhaps we'll have some substitution of that labor, and perhaps that's associated with more onshoring of some supply chains in the US. But we're also in a context where there are some very efficient, low wage countries. And if those countries are able to keep their wages low, and I will not comment on how they keep their wages low, you can comment on that, or you can think about it, or you can go away and read about it. It's all public domain. If these countries keep their wages low, that's an additional element of the world economy that matters. Now, if those countries adopt AI, perhaps they're less likely to do that because the cost of labor is lower. But if they do adopt AI in those manufacturing businesses, that's going to have a big additional impact on global inequality and maybe some other dimensions of global tension. In conclusion, what are the policies that could support a worker-friendly version of AI, which is what we're advocating for and what we're pressing forward on? So our recommendations are use the strategic power of the government to push for grand challenges that are helping improve outcomes in education, healthcare, government services, focus on consumers. DARPA had a big impact on self-driving cars. Why not have a big impact on helping consumers manage their finances better? OSHA protections, so workplace protections against excessive surveillance. If surveillance makes you safer at work, then I think we can have the conversation. But if that surveillance presses you to work harder, and if it causes more workplace accidents, I think that's a problem. And in that context, let me state the obvious, which hopefully is on everyone's mind, which is your privacy is being invaded on a daily, if not hourly basis by this technology, attempting to find out things about you so that digital ads can be served to you in a way that will make you more angry, more engaged, more upset. I mean, that's the reality of how it works. So protections on the worker side is going to be important. Protection on the consumer side, I think we should need to get to that also. And why not use the buying power of government and the need to deliver government services to create a market for AI that will pull the developers towards better government services, for example, rather than digital advertising that makes you more angry. The government has a big opportunity here. Whether or not they'll seize it remains to be seen. I don't think anything in the US policy sphere necessarily happens smoothly, but I think the direction of technology can be altered, at least to some extent, by government actions and decisions and visions, and maybe some government money, but also by government supported visions. Government at all levels, local government, state government, and federal government. In our view, we'd be better off if we could shift corporate norms so that people who run companies are more interested in worker augmentation and less interested in burdensome surveillance or outright replacing workers. That's a heavy lift, I'll give you that, but something worth working on. And there's also, I think, a lot of interest among workers and among trade unions in terms of thinking through their needs and the kind of training that will help them use this technology and support the development of new tasks, which they can do and then benefit from. So actually, the conversation with workers and union representatives is a very good one, very productive, very focused. With people who run big companies, not so much, honestly, but I think it needs to be done. And just to come back to and to tell you, the book has a lot more on this, which is the danger posed to democracy, including through the power of manipulation, which is represented by what you see now as digital advertising, but which will come to you in many other forms, because this software can figure out almost everything about you, including what makes you upset, what makes you angry, what causes you to spend hours and hours on the internet. And it can do that for you. Most of you, I would imagine, are fully grown adults, and so perhaps you can fend for yourself. It can also do it, and it does do it, is being done for young adults, for teenagers, and I'm afraid to say for children, which is pretty horrible and a massive embarrassment to our society and profoundly dangerous. But that is the reality. So the book is Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle of Technology Prosperity. It's coming out in 20 languages, some of which actually had rather colorful covers I wanted to show you here. And I'm very happy to take your questions and discuss further. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Simon. We had a lot of interest for your seminar, so I'm going to take my power as the moderator and ask my questions first. All right, so I'm glad that you talked about both jobs, income, and wages in your talk. It's related to something I've been thinking about, like what is the metric or metrics that we should keep track of to see if prosperity from new technologies are actually shared broadly? The reason I'm thinking about this is, one, if I think about employment or hours, historically, hours have been trending down, maybe because as people get richer, they want to have more leisure. And then if I think about jobs, as you said, jobs could change. There could be new jobs, there could be new tasks. But then if I think about labor income share, I mean, maybe workers could also be getting income from investment, say NVIDIA, I don't know. So I guess it's just a big, broader question about what are some of the metrics that you think we should keep track of to make sure that we know whether technology is being shared.
Well, I think all of the above would be a good place to start, but I think particularly what happens to the wages, the earned wages of people with different education levels, I think that's a pretty robust statistic over time. That's what didn't increase early in the Industrial Revolution, did increase after the 1850s in countries that were doing well, and that's what has lagged since 1980. So for people who didn't go to college, or people who only had 1 year of college or 2 years of college, how are they doing relative to other people in the earned income distribution?
I see. And then you showed that the labor share of income in the US, it has dropped since the 80s, but still remain somewhere above, like around like 60%. So there's some force that I think is keeping the labor share income at that 60% and not tank completely because of pace of automation. I guess there's a theory about new tasks being created so that workers always have something to do. Do you see, like, going forward that AI could make that maintaining the labor share income more difficult, or we can rely on some of the existing forces that happen already to keep us at 60%?
Well, that's a good question, but what are those other forces? I mean, trade unions are much weaker than before. There's been a little rebound in let's call it the COVID era, but remains to be seen how widespread and how sustained that is. I think what I would take from that comparative chart is that the US labor share could easily be pushed down further to the level that we see in some of those other countries where you don't have revolutions, you don't have social turmoil, and capital gets a much larger share of income. So I don't think there's any natural bottoming out of that labor share, except perhaps what we see in a broad cross-section of countries.
Okay. I think union is a big question right now, but in general, just bargaining power of workers. There are studies that suggest maybe bargaining power of worker has declined because there's more concentration of firms or monopoly power, basically. Do you see anything that could go against, like, balance things out? I guess unions have its own issues as well. Does it have to be more unionization of workers, or are there other ways for workers to maintain bargaining power?
Well, bargaining power, of course, did shift during COVID considerably for less skilled workers, and my colleague David Autor has a very nice paper with colleagues looking at what may have happened there, and they think that perhaps some of the less good matches between workers and jobs were broken because of the disruption of COVID, and then the workers went to get jobs that actually pay them better, and that may have eliminated perhaps up to a third of the previous widening of wages. So that's a big deal if that lasts. I think without trade unions, it's hard for it to last. What happens to the macroeconomy? Can the Fed run the economy hot, not too hot, and so on and so forth? I will not comment on that. But you can. There's some macroeconomic variables there that really matter a lot. At the same time, the micro monopsony type of power imbalances temporarily changed during COVID. Not clear at all that they've permanently changed.
I see. In your talk, you mentioned that there are debates about productivity, how much AI will affect productivity. Daron Acemoglu has a paper on that. I think our previous seminar speaker, Philippe Aguillon, is on another end of that spectrum. What do you see are some of the big unknowns or things that research should pin down better to figure out what will be the effect of AI on productivity going forward?
Yeah, that's something that we're working on pretty actively. So are other people. So it's a
Yes.
great space. It's
Yeah.
a great space to get into. I think that there's a lot of discussion and a lot of rhetoric about what exactly is happening in call centers, for example, or auto repair shops, or coding operations. I think that all that evidence is very partial and very preliminary. And I don't think we've got a really good grip on measuring the new tasks piece. I think we can see, for example, a customer service call used to take 8 minutes, and now it takes 7 minutes because the transcription of the call, which is very important for medical calls, for example, that transcription is actually done better by the machine than by the human. So you needed a certain staffing level to handle 8 minutes per call. Now it's 7 minutes per call. Okay, look, we're not anti-technology and we're not against improving the quality of customer service. The question is, are you just going to reduce the workforce? Do you need 7/8 of what you had before? Are there new tasks that can be taken on? What are the people who leave those jobs? What do they go on to do? Of course, a lot of women, if we go back roughly 100 years, a lot of young women in the US, the number one employer of young women in the US was telephone exchanges. Manual switching was an enormous employer of young women, and automated switching meant that those women did not have those opportunities, but many of them went on to find other opportunities, other jobs, other careers, which were difficult because they were discriminated against for sure. But just removing those positions doesn't necessarily create mass unemployment. It depends on what else is happening in the labor market and to what extent people can adapt, including young people.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. One thing I really appreciate from your talk and also reading your most recent book is that the direction of technology and innovation is not something that's given. Someone's making the choice. Someone is making the investment to make those innovations happen. In your opinion, what directions of AI innovation that's happening currently concerns you, or are there any other directions where you see could be very beneficial for society in your perspective?
Well, most of AI is obviously coming from a small set of companies and a particular set of people, mostly white men, middle-aged, with a certain view of the world. And I think it's a bit of a problem that there aren't more people at those design tables. And I think it's something that can be offset by having customers who say, we're a big potential market, we will buy things that do the following. And providing those specifications to AI developers could actually shift the incentives. Because right now, as far as we can see, an awful lot of the motivation on the corporate side is digital advertising dollars. And the way they get more digital advertising dollars is obviously with more of your attention. And the way they get more of your attention is by upsetting you or me or anybody more. And that's a bit of a problem, right? Because that suggests there's an enormous amount of human ingenuity going into upsetting people, including very young people. Now, why not have a big pursuit of better delivery of government services in some form, or we could have some transformation of education, whatever people think is important and worth pursuing, or healthcare. So all of these are potential objectives, but I think what happens sometimes, including in this economy, maybe we're a little more susceptible, is we become obsessed with technology for the sake of technology. Whereas what we should be saying is we want technology that will serve certain goals, deliver against those goals for us. I think that's a more productive, for this instance, that's a more productive way forward.
Yes, I recently read a report from Stanford Digital Economy Lab, Eric Renelfson's, your colleagues, previous colleagues' lab. They mentioned that because training generative AI models just takes a lot of resources, and you also need a lot of data, and you need a lot of computing power. So innovation in that is done more and more by the private sector, by industry, as opposed to universities. Do you feel that it could be a little bit concerning in that the private sector is more profit-driven, whereas the university could be driven by other things? Should there be more research done by universities as opposed to industry?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question and a fair question. I think that ship has sailed. Maybe some years ago we could have had a different set of priorities and different set of funding, but now many of the smart people from the university sector are moving to the private sector, probably or possibly in part for the money, but also because that's where the data are and that's where the compute is, the compute that they want to access. So I think that rather than trying to resist that or prevent it, you're better off, as I said, as we do with vaccines, to say, look, here is a pot of gold. If you develop something that will transform the provision of the following services that matter to us as government, you will access that market. And this is what I also say to countries around the world, many of which approach us and say, we're very excited about AI. How do we get Silicon Valley to develop something for example, Indonesian or Brazilian agriculture? To which my reaction is, I don't think you're going to get that, because that's not an item that's high on their agenda. It's not a big moneymaker. But if you go to them as a large market, if you say we're 1 billion consumers, or we have a large spend on the following sectors, and we will buy things that address these problems of poverty in a certain set of countries, that then becomes a more interesting conversation. That's what more likely to tilt the developers. The companies are pursuing money. They're pursuing market opportunity, and I think that is. You can complain about it, but the only way to change that is to offer them alternative, strong, money-based opportunities.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you very much for answering my questions. I've taken plenty of time, and we got a lot of questions submitted for this. So I'm going to move to the pre-submitted questions for people who registered online. So first, we actually have a question from one of our economists in our research department. He asked, how do you characterize and respond to David Autor's argument that AI is likely to boost the economic status of the US middle class after decades of technology and trade-driven erosion?
Well, as I mentioned throughout, David is one of my close colleagues
Yes.
who work on these issues. And we even have a paper together last year along the lines of can we have pro-worker AI? So I think that David is hopeful, and David is hopeful that AI can have this kind of task. In order for it to have the kinds of benefits that David wants, if you buy David's view of the world, which I do, you have to create a new tasks that require expertise. So if AI does that, then yes, absolutely, we can have some very good outcomes, and including for people with not much by way of formal education. I think my concern, and Daron's concern, because the two of us wrote the book, is that on our current path, with our current set of corporate priorities driving both the design and the development of the technology, but also the adoption of the technology and what companies are trying to do with it, the focus is on reducing labor costs. And if that's the focus, rather than creating new opportunities and worker augmentation, focusing on reducing labor costs and automating and replacing labor, you're not going to get, unfortunately, you're less likely to get the outcomes that David is suggesting. I mean, David's right. It's all possible. We can and should reach for it. I think, David's work is inspirational in that way. But it's a lot of work, and, we are a little bit behind on this.
Yeah. I mean, I think from reading your book and also your talk, I think there is the possibility of what technology can do, but then actually which one actually realizes and whether that gets shared between people equally, that's a separate question, and that might not be a given.
Yeah, I think technology can do anything you want, but it's all about who's in charge, who makes the calls, where the resources go, and absolutely, it's all available as a choice. Yeah. But who makes the choice?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Our next question is about the impact on future jobs. You touched on this somewhat in your presentation, but maybe we can take the opportunity to elaborate a little bit more. So the question is about how AI will impact jobs in developing countries versus developed countries, And also, do you think there are particular jobs, like technical jobs, that will be more displaced versus, I guess, there are other jobs that are less technical?
Yeah, look, great question. And as I said, there is no hard evidence on this one way or another so far. On the one hand, you might think, okay, developing countries have lower wages, so there's less incentive to replace people compared with the United States, for example. So that would mean that you'd keep more labor-intensive processes working. On the other hand, we know one characteristic of this technology is that while it's developed for a rich country, mostly the United States, that's the primary market of interest, it focuses on activities and tasks that are pretty universal, like writing in English. So I already know people who have fired employees whose job it was to write in English, particularly when English was not their first language, because they can have ChatGPT do the first draft better in their view, and then they can hire a native speaker, just tweak it and polish it up at the end. The Hollywood writers who went on strike last year were very focused, and I think quite smartly, on exactly this, that Hollywood or creative arts type producer can already tell GPT or equivalent the storyline that they want, and it can have them write a rough first draft and then hire somebody straight out of film school to polish it up and make it seem like a human wrote it. So you just don't need, you're very close to not needing the right number of writers. Now, the strike ended up with an agreement not to do that. So we'll see if they've sufficiently altered the path of the technology, but I think they were quite well informed and smart to focus on that issue. So the same thing is true for developing countries, is that the technology, you know, if people remember the literature from the 1960s and 70s on so-called appropriate and inappropriate technology, when you develop a technology in a capital-intensive country and it becomes available around the world, there are countries that will adopt it and displace workers because that's what you need to be considered high standards, or that's makes it easier to control the workforce. That's not what would have happened if they didn't have access to that technology from the rich countries. But you can't stop AI from spreading. I mean, ChatGPT was, as far as I can see, tried out by almost in every single imaginable corner of the world within 24 hours of its release in 2022.
Yeah, the spread of ChatGPT is quite fast compared to what we've seen before. And I think even if there are guardrails against using ChatGPT, I feel like you cannot really stop people from using it if you want to try it.
Exactly. People will use it and they'll train it without worrying about any of the implications for their jobs or their societies, because it's fun. And that's a different kind of technology than anything we saw in machine tools or chemicals or textiles.
So our next question is about the concept of pro-worker technology. Are there any examples that you see now that could be going in the direction of being pro-worker, like technologies that are being pro-worker? And what are some of the steps that either companies or government can take to promote the development, adoption of pro-worker AI?
So historically, there are plenty of examples, and that's in the book, for example, from that second part of the Industrial Revolution, where machines are making workers more productive. So it's worker augmentation rather than worker displacement. I think if you look at the more modern US economy, this is before AI, the development of nurse practitioners and their abilities and skills and also their compensation, that's something that has been supported by technology. Perhaps it wasn't the main driver, but it's definitely not been a problem for that part of the healthcare sector. And so I think it's that kind of what sometimes people call modern craft workers with some formal education, a lot of skill and experience, enabling them to have a better ability to understand a situation, to either resolve it or pass it up to somebody else who has more specialized expertise. I think that is quite promising conceptually. Whether that can happen at scale, and sufficient scale, to create well-paying opportunities, that absolutely remains to be seen.
We had quite a few questions that's more about like AI, concerns about just how good AI can actually perform. So issues about bias, about hallucination. So on the bias side, because Gen AI models are trained on certain sets of data, so there could be biases inherent in just the way these products are being produced. Do you see any of that incidents being concerning, or are there ideas that you have for how we could guard against that type of biases?
Yeah, I think it's a big concern and a very legitimate concern. Obviously, humans are biased also, so we should be frank about that, and maybe this is pushing us to think more about that and to measure that as well. I think that having access to the previous generations of GPT, for example, so that researchers can look at the weights and actually just figure out, reverse engineer how decisions were made or how resources were allocated, that would be very helpful. The companies don't want to provide that, by the way.
Of course.
I don't think they will unless they're full. Well, it's not. This is not the. You could ask, of course, for this to be for the cutting edge of technology to be transparent. But there are some proprietary reasons why they don't want to show you that. But why not show you what was in earlier versions of GPT that they're not currently selling, so we could see, so that specialized researchers can see more inside the black box. That seems quite appropriate. And without that, it's very hard to know what weights the algorithm is putting on which variables, and was it going off variables that we would regard as legitimate and reasonable, or was it playing off and making decisions or providing advice based on characteristics that we would regard quite reasonably as massively unacceptable or even illegal to use if it was all out in the open? That we don't know, and I think that there will increasingly be clamor to reveal that.
And then in terms of, there's bias, but then I think there's also a question about whether the responses, say ChatGPT or other generative AI tools that give us is actually true or not, because there's the issue of hallucination, for example. Do you think the same approach of having more examination of these algorithms by just researchers in general will help against hallucination, or just making sure the answers are more correct?
Well, the industry is very focused on reducing the rate of hallucination, partly because it's massively embarrassing and a problem. Look, I think the rates that they claim for the latest technology are already substantially reduced. So this might recede as a public issue. But I do think that the bigger issue is any technology that tells you there is one right answer and here it is. And you say, oh, great, I have the right answer now. And it's a very big, bad mistake in terms of human cognition, human innovation, how we've ever achieved anything individually or in our societies. If you rely excessively, the motto of the Royal Society of Britain, which was founded in the 1600s, is in Latin, which is usually translated as take nobody's word for it. In other words, run the experiment yourself. This is the key idea of the Enlightenment, which is you don't rely on some religious figure or the king or even Lord so-and-so with whatever medals, the professor or whatever at Oxford. You don't rely on them for the truth. You challenge everything. You question everything. You run your own experiments. You try to generate your own data. You argue it out with your colleagues. And I think allowing a big advantage of Western societies compared to anything that anyone ever tried before. I mean, West societies have lots of problems, and we can all have any misgivings about things that happened in the past, but they were very fractious and very willing to challenge authority, and that's something that became reinforced by the way in which the Industrial Revolution developed, and that, I think, we might lose, or we're in real danger of losing, if we rely excessively on anyone's authority, including the authority of some supposedly omnipresent AI.
Mm-hmm. I think the ability to think critically, my impression is that I learned my ability to think critically through education. So one question we have is about young people going forward with this new technology in the horizon. Are there anything in the education system that could better prepare the students or people going into the job market going forward about how to prepare for this AI-driven future?
Yeah, absolutely. I think challenge everything. Think critically. That's exactly the right words. I worry a lot that I think STEM education is very important. I work at MIT, so they wanted me to say that. But I do think that we must not neglect and forget all the other parts of education, which are not STEM, but which are about arguing and reasoning and thinking about, okay, who's this person? What is their interest? Why are they saying this to me? What is the evidence here exactly? I think that is fundamental to democracy. It's also fundamental to innovation. And there are many people who say, well, look, whatever your other misgivings, Simon, don't worry, AI will so accelerate innovation that we'll all be running our own galaxies soon. Okay, that's one possibility. Another possibility is we'll get less innovation, less productivity growth with AI, because it's the ragged edge of human cognition that generates many of our big breakthrough ideas. The fact that something doesn't make sense to you, the fact that, you're annoyed with the process, the fact that there's just something that's bothering you about the consensus. Those are the sparks of breakthrough ideas and the sparks that change society in positive ways. And if you allow AI to extinguish those sparks, I think we'll all regret it.
Right. So challenge the consensus and challenge the standard narrative. Have your own narrative.
Good advice for economists, good advice for social scientists, and I think good advice for all of us.
All right. Well, we've come to the end of our seminar. Thank you so much, Simon, for giving us your time and your views. I've learned a lot from this, so thank you.